So switching from languages like Java, C#, and C, C++, we'll kind of go into something a little different that's used more for database querying, and this is SQL, a structured query language. And it's pronounced generally SQL. Some people pronounce it SQL.
Some people will say the whole acronym, but generally SQL. I had a friend of mine that was in a job interview, and he was a SQL expert. Like, he was great at SQL. And when he went to the job interview, they asked him, "How well do you know SQL?" And he said, I've never heard of SQL before. Well, it's because his whole life he called it SQL. He never knew it was pronounced SQL. Huh. So make sure that you note that in case you go to a job interview.
Absolutely.
If you don't know that.
So this is primarily a language that allows you to extract and manipulate and insert data in a database. And the language varies between types of database and database servers, but it generally maintains commonalities, common thread. A lot of the flavors of SQL is Microsoft SQL Server, which uses T-SQL, MySQL, Oracle, PostgreSQL, Sybase, DB2, which is IBM's. They all have the similar structure in that they generally say select this from this, where that is that. But some of the functions that you use, like the length of a string, for example,
and syntax as well. Like in Microsoft SQL Server, it uses kind of like the VB style strings where you don't have to escape.
Yep.
So like if you wanted to put something like a tab character, you have to put it in specially, because if you put, and this may be advanced for some people, but the /T sequence, which everything else in the world uses except for Microsoft SQL Server, it will actually take that as a literal string.
So some people will argue that you can write anything that you could in a normal programming language in SQL.
Don't listen to them.
Don't listen to them, because they're probably insane.
They have lost their mind. They've gotten too deep.
Yes.
And I guess those are the people that just get too comfortable with it.
They're like the Apocalypse Now people. Like, they've been in the war for too long, and there's no returning. You can never go back home.
Oh, God, that's a great analogy. I love it.
But SQL's great. It's absolutely great.
It's fantastic.
You have to know it. You're any application, any website, anything that you do now, you're going to be using data in a database.
Absolutely. And the push in application development now is in that direction, where everything is retrieving data from something.
Absolutely.
So if you don't know SQL, you're screwed.
Yeah.
At least the basic elements of SQL.
And not all places will have a database administrator or a database expert to help you. So a lot of times you go into a development shop and there really is no SQL expert. So it's good to know this inside and out.
And just because they're SQL experts doesn't necessarily mean they know exactly what they're doing.
No, absolutely.
Especially the ones that think that they can write full applications in SQL.
Never trust them.
Absolutely not. The next one that we want to talk about is, I think, a really great language. It's called TCL. Now, TCL is not as common as some of the other languages that we talked about, but if you work in certain industries, you have a 100% chance of running across TCL.
Absolutely. And the industries that employ this language are massive industries. It's
huge.
Finance, healthcare, robotics industries, and they're very widespread. A lot of development jobs, a significant percentage of development jobs are in these industries.
So, I mean, TCL is a scripting language. You can kind of think of it like Perl, for those of you that need something to compare it to. It's interpreted. It's typically found as an embedded language. Now, what that means is a lot of stuff that you see written in TCL is not an application from the start. It's an application that has some need of some customization, and a TCL program is used to customize something within that application.
Right. TCL is very fast, and it's very ideal for short scripts that need to execute many, many times over. So if there's an application, let's say a financial application, and every time you have a transaction of money, and you need to do validation on that amount, you need to perform a short script that's unique to that particular transaction type from a particular source to a particular destination. TCL would be a great fit for writing a short script to evaluate that cost. Or in the healthcare field, if you have any piece of information of a patient gets transmitted across all systems in a hospital system, and those also have to be validated, or they have to be checked to make sure, whatever, and transformed to be compatible with other systems.
You will have to consistently take one transaction type from one system, do a bunch of conversions, and send it to another. And this is going to happen thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of times in a day. So this is a perfect language for that. And I also want to add one other thing, and I think Brian and I both have a problem with this. Some people actually call this language tickle.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Yeah, and when you read any documentation, you'll actually see, like, that's a real thing. People call it tickle. And we have a serious... Because when you say HTML, do you say HTML? Well, PHP, do you say...
Tickle just sounds stupid.
It does sound stupid.
Don't be an ass.
Yeah, just call it...
Don't say tickle, it's TCL.
Call it TCL.
Whatever.
Come on, people. We live in a society here, you know?
Yeah, have a cup of TCL.
Exactly. Oh, baby! Is this happening now?
Yeah.
Oh. So, and last... Drum roll, please. But least. Now, okay, some of you guys are going to get angry at this, but the language that we're mentioning last for a reason is Visual Basic. And we have our reasons. So don't hate us now. Listen to us first.
So Visual Basic is visual, beginners, all-purpose, symbolic, instruction, code.
Now stop for a second. Let's analyze what that acronym stands for. Beginners, all-purpose, symbolic instruction code implies that this language was developed and designed to be used by people that weren't computer programmers. As a matter of fact, the actual people that created the basic language have even said that this is for non-computer science people. It was designed to be a stripped-down, dummy language for people to write software that have no business writing software.
Right. Or as a learning tool. Sometimes.
Yeah, like the old Commodore 64s. You know, when computers were first coming into people's houses, there weren't full-blown applications like we know today. You would actually have to get a computer and program it to do something, and BASIC was a common language at that time because you were getting people that did not go through college and engineering schools writing their own software.
Absolutely. But it's primarily geared for non-computer science people. So somehow it's still popular today.
Before you go that far, let's also mention that Visual Basic is a Microsoft implementation of the BASIC language. It is kind of like, the .NET C#. It's Microsoft's flavor of the BASIC language. And in the earlier stages of Microsoft, BASIC was their child. It was their baby. They wanted everything written in BASIC. Mm-hmm. So in the early 90s, Visual Basic kind of gained popularity and has kind of been on a downward slope. So Brian and I don't really understand why it still exists at all. But thankfully, it seems to be in a decline.
Now, and I'll say this in our defense. Visual Basic is kind of like John Bon Jovi. So you don't necessarily hate Bon Jovi, but you really hate his fans. So we kind of hate Visual Basic for that reason, because a lot of people who write adamantly in Visual Basic are really kind of set on Visual Basic should be the only language on Earth.
Nothing else compares.
No, and they're very, very sensitive about this, and they're very defensive. And I think it's because when they learn this language, Visual Basic is not in the lineage of the C-structured languages.
Yes.
So the way that it looks is not like Pascal and C and C++. It
doesn't look like anything. Yeah, right. It's its own thing.
It's very different.
Right.
So if you primarily learned on Visual Basic, that learning curve to jump from Visual Basic to one of the C lineage languages is a lot steeper.
Especially if you've been in it for years, it's almost impossible.
Yes. So Visual Basic people tend to have a very insulated exposure. And I think that maybe, from a more sinister, cynical point of view, probably why Microsoft was such a big proponent of it.
Visual Basic also does have a scripting component called VBScript. Mm-hmm. And unlike JavaScript, it actually looks very similar to Visual Basic.
Yeah. And VBA, which is Visual Basic for applications.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like VBScript, but it runs in like Excel and Access, Word even. And
we're sitting here kind of joking about this, but Visual Basic you do commonly see in realms of ASP development, applications for desktop. But one of the trends that Brian and I have seen in the last, 2 or so years, is that there are some places that want you to know Visual Basic for the explicit reason of taking code that was written in Visual Basic and rewrite it in another language. That is a very common trend.
Very, very common.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's most commonly moved to C# and .NET.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Generally speaking.